The morning of the 4th of June, 1942 began like any other at sea, with the smell of salt and oil, the low thrumming of engines beneath steel decks, and quiet, practice routines of men who had learned to sleep through danger. Aboard the Japanese carrier strike force known as WWII, the most powerful naval air armada the world had ever assembled, there was confidence. There was, in truth, something closer to certainty. 6 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of the most experienced naval aviators in the Pacific. The men of the Imperial Japanese Navy had not lost a major engagement since the war began. They had struck Pearl Harbor and walked away untouched. They had swept through the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Ceylon. Every enemy they had faced had broken before them. And yet, somewhere out there in the blue expanse northwest of Midway Atoll, 3 American carriers waited. Their commanders knew exactly where the Japanese were. They knew what was coming, and they knew when. The Japanese did not know the Americans were there at all. That asymmetry, one side blind, one side watching, was not the product of luck or superior American seamanship, or even of raw courage, though courage would be required in abundance before the day was done. It was a product of a single, extraordinary intelligence operation, built on years of painstaking work by a group of men sitting not on the bridge of a warship, but in a basement in Pearl Harbor, hunched over intercepts that most of their own superiors had dismissed as unreliable. It was built in no small part on the work of one man whose methods had been questioned, whose conclusions had been doubted, and whose most critical breakthrough had very nearly been ignored entirely. His name was Joseph Rockefort, and the story of what he did and what it cost him is one of the most consequential and most quietly devastating stories of the entire Second World War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Rockefort accomplished, you have to understand first what he was working against. Not just the Japanese code, but the institutional culture of the United States Navy itself, which, in years before Midway, treated signals intelligence with a mixture of suspicion and condescension that bordered on willful blindness. Joseph James Rockefort was born in 1900 in Dayton, Ohio. He entered the Navy in 1918 and spent his early career as a surface warfare officer, the kind of posting that was considered the real Navy, ships and guns and sea time, not pencils and code books. But Rockefort was a different kind of mind. He was drawn to language, to pattern, to the peculiar intellectual satisfaction of a problem that resisted solution. In the mid-1920s, he was selected for a secret assignment, learning Japanese cryptanalysis. He spent 3 years in Japan, studying the language and the culture, attending geisha parties as cover, absorbing not just vocabulary and grammar, but the deeper rhythms of Japanese thought. He came back fluent, precise, and equipped with a form of understanding that very few Americans possessed. By 1941, Rockefort was commander of Station HYPO, the Navy's Communications Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor. His operation was housed in a basement beneath the 14th Naval District Headquarters, a place his men called a dungeon. It was not a glamorous posting. The ceiling was low, the lighting was poor, the machinery was unreliable. Rockefort himself was known for working days at a stretch without leaving, padding around in a velvet smoking jacket and carpet slippers, a coffee cup always within reach, wrestling with intercepts in a state of focused dishevelment that his superiors found vaguely undignified. The Japanese naval code his unit was targeting was known as JN-25. It was not a simple cipher. It was a 2-part system, a code book of roughly 45,000 5-digit groups, each representing a word, phrase, or concept, combined with an additive cipher, a separate book of random numbers that was added to codebook values before transmission to further obscure the meaning. To read even a fragment of a message required stripping the additive, which meant accumulating enough repeated cipher groups to begin reconstructing the additive book statistically. It was painstaking, probabilistic work that required not just mathematical aptitude, but an almost artistic sensitivity to context, to the way Japanese naval officers phrased things, the conventions they used, the shortcuts they took. Rockefort's team had been chipping away at JN-25 since before Pearl Harbor. The attack on December 7, 1941, was a shock, a catastrophic failure warning, but it also, paradoxically, supercharged the work. The Japanese shifted to a new version of JN-25 25 on December 4th, just 3 days before the attack, resetting months of accumulated knowledge. But they did not change the underlying structure of the system, and Rockefeller's team, now working with intensity bordering on obsession, began breaking back in. By the spring of 1942, they were reading fragments, sometimes 10% of a message, sometimes 30, sometimes less, fitting the fragments together through inference and accumulated context into a picture that was imperfect, but, in Rockefeller's judgment, consistent. What the picture showed was alarming. The Japanese were planning a major offensive operation. It would involve their full carrier striking force. It would be directed at a target designated in the intercepts as AF. The question was, where was AF? This was not, as it might appear from a distance of 80 years, a trivial problem. The Japanese used geographic designators throughout their communications, and the Americans had decoded many of them, but not all. AF appeared in context suggesting it was a specific location, likely an island, somewhere in the Central Pacific. Rockefeller believed, based on accumulated intercept analysis and a close reading of the operational patterns he had observed, that AF was Midway Atoll, a small but strategically critical American installation roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. His superiors in Washington were not convinced. The Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, the rival signals intelligence operation under Captain John Redman, looked at the same fragmentary evidence and reached a different conclusion. Their analysts believed the Japanese objective might be the Aleutian Islands, or possibly the west coast of the United States, or perhaps a feint toward one of several possible targets. The Washington analysts had access to a broader range of signals traffic, but Rockefeller argued they lacked the contextual depth, the accumulated, intimate familiarity with Japanese naval communications patterns that his team had developed in the dungeon. The disagreement was not merely professional. It was personal and institutional, edged with the kind of territorial rivalry that flourishes in large bureaucracies. Redman and his brother, Captain Joseph Redman, viewed Rockefeller and station HYPO with particular contempt of men who believe their own headquarters perspective is inherently superior to the view from the field. Rockefeller, for his part, was not a man who softened his opinions to accommodate the feelings of superiors he believed to be wrong. The stakes of the disagreement could not have been higher. If Washington was right, and Midway was not the target, Admiral Chester Nimitz would need to position his carriers somewhere else, and the Japanese would arrive at their actual objective unopposed. If Rockefeller was right and the carriers were sent to Midway, they would either catch the Japanese by surprise or miss them entirely, depending on the accuracy of his read on the timing and composition of the Japanese force. Rockefeller needed to prove AF was Midway, and he devised one of the most elegant deceptions in the history of intelligence to do it. The plan was simple. Midway was instructed to transmit a plain-language radio message, unencrypted, deliberately clear, reporting that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down and that the island was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. The message was sent. Within 48 hours, a Japanese intercept was captured and brought to the dungeon. It reported, in the partially readable fragments of JN-25, that AF was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. The Japanese had taken the bait. They had repeated the Midway water shortage in their own operational traffic, and in doing so, they had handed Rockefeller the confirmation he needed. AF was Midway. The attack was coming. Washington remained skeptical even after the water ruse. The Redman brothers continued to push their alternative assessments. But Admiral Nimitz, who had cultivated his own judgment about intelligence and the men who produced it, made a decision. He trusted Rockefeller. He positioned his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the last of which had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier that Japanese intelligence assessed it would be in dry dock for months, northeast of Midway, in a position of ambush. He called the assembly point Point Luck. The repair crews at Pearl Harbor worked around the clock for 72 hours to make Yorktown fit for combat. She was not fully repaired. She was patched, braced, and sent back to sea. But she was there. To understand the battle that followed, it is necessary to understand the specific geography of Japanese overconfidence in the spring of 1942, not as a character flaw, but as a rational, evidence-based certainty that had been repeatedly confirmed by experience. The commanders of WWII, and particularly its tactical commander, Vice Admiral Chichi Nagumo, had every reason to believe they were operating inside a strategic envelope that the Americans could not penetrate. The Japanese carrier force had been undefeated. Its aircraft, the Mitsubishi Zero fighter, the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, the Aichi D-3A dive bomber, were demonstrably superior to their early war American equivalents in several critical respects. The Zero's range, maneuverability, and rate of climb were extraordinary by 1941 standards. The Kate torpedo bomber was faster and more reliable than the American Douglas Devastator. Japanese aircrews were in many cases veterans of the China campaigns, with hundreds of hours of combat flying behind them. The Japanese operational plan for Midway, designated MI, was accordingly ambitious in a way that reflected this confidence. The strike force would neutralize Midway's defenses from the air, establishing local air superiority. An amphibious landing force would then take the island. American carriers, if they appeared at all, and Japanese intelligence assessed the probability of their timely response as low, would be dealt with in a subsequent fleet engagement. The battle plan accounted for uncertainty, but it assumed a certain kind of uncertainty. The passive, reactive uncertainty of an enemy that would need time to respond, time to assemble, time to understand what was happening. It did not account for the possibility that the Americans already knew. Nagumo's force approached Midway from the northwest in the pre-dawn darkness of the 4th of June, 1942. His strike package, 108 aircraft in the first wave, lifted off into the still dark sky at 0430. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters. It was an impressive sight, remembered by those who saw it as something almost beautiful in its terrible precision. The planes lifting one by one from the flight decks, their running lights briefly visible against the stars before they disappeared into the darkness to the southeast. What Nagumo did not know was that 90 miles away, 3 American carriers were already at general quarters. Their radar operators were tracking the incoming Japanese aircraft. Their pilots were in their cockpits, and their strike packages were being spotted on the flight decks, fueled and armed, waiting for the order to launch. The first American strike from Midway itself went in before the carrier aircraft could launch, a series of attacks by Marine Corps dive bombers, Army Air Force's B-17s flying from the island, and the torpedo bombers of Marine Torpedo Bombing Squadron 240. The results were, by any honest assessment, poor. The high-level B-17 attacks produced no hits on the maneuvering Japanese carriers. The Marine dive bombers were the obsolete Vought SB-2U Vindicator, outclassed in every performance category by their opposition. The torpedo bombers were shot to pieces by the Zero Combat Air Patrol before they could release. The men who flew these missions were not lacking in courage. They were lacking in aircraft, in experience, and, for the Devastator crews especially, in weapons. The American Mark 13 torpedo of that period had a reliability rate that would have been embarrassing in peacetime, prone to running too deep, running erratic, or simply failing to detonate on impact. But these attacks served a purpose that was not apparent at the time. Each wave forced Nagumo to keep his combat air patrol fighters active, flying and fighting and burning fuel at low altitude. And each attack deepened the growing problem on Nagumo's flight decks. The problem had begun before dawn, in the decision about how to arm the reserve strike aircraft. Nagumo had launched his first wave against Midway's ground installations with his strike aircraft armed accordingly, incendiary and high-explosive bombs appropriate for hitting runways, fuel tanks, and buildings. He had held back a second strike package, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, against the possibility of American warships appearing. When the first wave's commander, Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga, radioed back that a second strike on Midway would be necessary to adequately suppress the island's defenses, Nagumo faced a choice. He ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs. This was a decision that would cost him everything. Rearming carrier aircraft in a combat environment is not a quick process. The torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs that had already been loaded onto the reserve aircraft had to be removed. Land attack ordnance had to be brought up from the magazines. In the cramped hangars below the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, crews worked with controlled urgency. The removed torpedoes, rather than being properly stowed in the magazines, a time-consuming process, were set aside on the hangar deck. This was a violation of standard procedure, But the pace of events permitted no other option. Time was the pressure. Time was always the pressure. Then came the report that changed everything. At 07:28, a Japanese scout plane, one of the float planes launched from a cruiser tone, running behind schedule due to a catapult malfunction that had delayed its departure by 30 minutes, radioed a contact report. Enemy surface ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo asked for clarification. What types of ships? The reply was maddening in its inadequacy. 10 enemy surface ships. 10 surface ships could be destroyers, cruisers, transports, or they could be something far worse. Nagumo asked again, are there carriers? The scout plane reported back. The enemy force appears to include a carrier. One carrier. The Japanese had believed there were no American carriers within striking range. Now there was at least one, perhaps more. On Akaji's bridge, in the moments that followed, Nagumo's staff debated with controlled panic the choices available to them. The rearming order for the reserve aircraft was suspended. The aircraft that had already been switched to land attack bombs now needed to be switched back to anti-ship ordnance. Meanwhile, the first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land. The flight decks were needed for recovery. The rearming was still incomplete. The American carrier aircraft arrived while all of this was unresolved, while the Japanese carriers were, in the words of one American officer who studied the battle exhaustively, in a state of maximum vulnerability. The first American carrier strikes were disasters for the attackers. The torpedo squadrons went in first, doctrine and desperation pushing them into the teeth of the Japanese combat air patrol, without fighter cover. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, 15 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, found the Japanese carrier force at around 0930. Waldron had navigated by instinct, breaking from the group flight plan because he believed correctly that the Japanese had changed course. He led his squadron in alone. Every one of his 15 aircraft was shot down. 30 men went into the water. One survived. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise followed minutes later. 10 of their 14 aircraft were destroyed. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, coming in at a slightly different angle, lost 10 of 12. Not a single American torpedo found its target, but the torpedo attacks had done something that cannot be measured in the damage they inflicted. They had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol fighters down to low altitude, down to the wave tops, where the Zeros were burning to the last of their fuel and ammunition, intercepting the slow, low-flying Devastators. They had fixed the attention of the Japanese gunners and the Japanese lookouts on the ocean surface. No one was looking up. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led the dive bombers of Enterprise's air group down from 14,000 feet in near-vertical dives onto the flight decks of Akaji and Kaga. At almost the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell, Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers rolled on Soryu. What happened in the next 5 minutes changed the war. Akaji was hit by 2 bombs, possibly 3. The hits were not by themselves catastrophic, but they fell into the hangar deck where the rearmed and rear-armed aircraft sat loaded with fuel and ordnance, surrounded by the carelessly stowed torpedoes that had been removed earlier, waiting beside carts of aviation gasoline and racks of bombs. The secondary explosions were, by every account of those who survived them, almost incomprehensible in their violence. Akaji's damage control crews fought through the morning and into the afternoon, but the fires they were fighting were not ordinary fires. They were chain reaction explosions in a sealed steel compartment packed with combustibles. By early afternoon, Nagumo himself had been forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Akaji burned through the night and sank the following morning. Kaga was hit by 4 bombs in the same attack. The results were similar. Explosions cascading through the hangar, fuel and ordnance feeding fires that spread faster than they could be contained. Kaga sank that afternoon. Soryu, hit by 3 bombs from Leslie's group, burned for less than 20 minutes before her captain ordered abandoned ship. She sank early that evening. 3 fleet carriers, 3 of the 6 that had struck Pearl Harbor, were on the bottom by nightfall. A 4th, Hiryu, survived the morning attack and launched her own strike, badly damaging Yorktown. But Hiryu was found by American dive bombers that afternoon and hit by 4 bombs. She burned through the night and sank the following morning. In a single day's fighting, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and, most critically, most irreversibly, approximately 3,000 aviators, mechanics, and carrier crew, including many of the most experienced naval airmen in the world. These were losses that could not be quickly replaced. Japan had no program to rapidly train experienced carrier aviators. The men who went down with Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been accumulating their expertise since before the war began. They were, in a meaningful sense, irreplaceable. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The aftermath of Midway was something that neither side fully understood in the immediate days and weeks that followed, because the Japanese, with characteristic determination, buried the truth as deeply as they could, and the Americans, having won an improbable victory, struggled to comprehend the scale of what had changed. The Japanese Navy's handling of Midway was a study in institutional denial. The survivors of the sunken carriers were quietly transferred to other posts, forbidden from discussing what had happened. The official communiques reported a great Japanese victory. Emperor Hirohito was not told the full truth of the disaster for months. The Japanese press published nothing about the loss of the carriers. The wounded from the battle were kept in isolated hospital wards, away from contact with the general public, so that even the families of the dead could not begin to piece together what had occurred. This secrecy was not merely propaganda. It was an attempt to prevent the psychological shockwave that the truth might produce from propagating through the Japanese war machine. But it had a second, more damaging effect. It prevented the Imperial Navy from conducting the kind of honest operational review that might have identified the failures, corrected the doctrines, and prepared more effectively for the battles to come. The lessons of Midway, the vulnerability of carriers to deck-level fires, the fatal consequences of the arming and rearming sequence, the inadequacy of the scout plane coverage, were not absorbed and acted upon with a rigor that a functioning institution might have applied. The rot was covered over. Rockefort, meanwhile, received neither the credit nor the honors that many believed he had earned. The Red Man brothers, whose rival assessments had nearly sent American carriers to the wrong part of the Pacific, moved in the months following Midway to consolidate their control over naval cryptanalysis and to sideline Rockefort specifically. In October of 1942, for months after the battle that his work had made possible, Rockefort was relieved of command of station HYPO and reassigned, first to a floating dry dock command, then to a series of posts that were, in the judgment of virtually everyone who has studied the period, a deliberate diminishment of man who had made enemies in Washington by being right. Admiral Nimitz recommended Rockefort for the Distinguished Service Medal in recognition of his role at Midway. The recommendation was rejected in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, denied the award. The reasons were never stated explicitly, but the institutional politics were transparent to those who observed them. Rockefort had embarrassed the Washington analysts by proving them wrong about the most consequential intelligence question of the Pacific War. In the Navy, as in most large organizations, being right at the expense of powerful men has its own particular costs. Rockefort did not receive the Distinguished Service Medal for his Midway work until 1985, 43 years after battle, 9 years after his death. The award was presented posthumously at a ceremony attended by his family and by several of the men who had worked with him in the dungeon. Admiral Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer and one of Rockefort's closest professional allies, had spent years lobbying for the recognition. He attended the ceremony. He died the following year. The men who had broken the Japanese code, who had read the intentions of an enemy fleet from fragments and inference, and particular kind of patient, unglamorous brilliance that does not photograph well, had won the most important intelligence victory of the Pacific War. They had done it in a basement, in carpet slippers, against the active resistance of their own chain of command. And then they had watched, mostly in silence, as the official history was written around them. There is a particular kind of military tragedy that has nothing to do with blood or fire. It is a tragedy of the institutional machine, the way that large organizations, under pressure, tend to reward the men who look right over the men who are right, to punish the accurate prophet and protect the confident fool, to mistake the confidence of headquarters for the wisdom of proximity. Rockefort understood this. He had lived it in an oral history recorded late in his life. He reflected on the events of 1942 with a characteristic dryness that contained, if you listened carefully, something considerably more complicated. He said, without apparent bitterness, that he had simply done his job. He had looked at the evidence and told a commander what he believed the evidence showed, whether that was rewarded or not was, he suggested, somewhat beside the point. The point was that the carriers were in the right place. The point was that at 10:22 on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, 3 American dive bomber squadrons found 4 Japanese fleet carriers with their decks crowded with fueled, armed, and armed-again aircraft, and the fire that followed did not go out for 24 hours. And when they did, the strategic balance of Pacific War had shifted in a way that Japan could never reverse. The point was that Midway was not, as it has sometimes been described, a miraculous American victory plucked from certain defeat by luck and heroism alone. Though luck and heroism were both present in abundance, it was a product of a specific intellectual effort, conducted by specific men in a specific basement, against specific institutional opposition. The heroes of Midway include the pilots who dove their aircraft into storms of anti-aircraft fire. They also include the men who never fired a shot, who sat in the dungeon for weeks and months, stripping additives and rebuilding code books, and arguing with Washington, until the picture became clear enough to act on. The Japanese fleet did not steam into the ambush at Midway because of American luck. It steamed into the ambush because a man in carpet slippers had read its mail. The broader strategic consequences of Midway were felt almost immediately, though their full weight took time to become apparent. Japan would never again hold the strategic initiative in the Pacific. The 6 months following Pearl Harbor, what Japanese commanders would later call the victory disease period, the time when the empire seemed capable of endless expansion, ended at Midway. Not because the Japanese military was destroyed, not because the industrial capacity of the empire collapsed overnight, but because of 4 carriers that burned on the 4th of June with a spine of the offensive capability that had made the blitzkrieg-style advances of 1941 and early 1942 possible. The Imperial Japanese Navy rebuilt. New carriers were commissioned. New aviators were trained. New aircraft entered service. The Zero was eventually supplemented, though never fully replaced, by improved designs. But the combination of the Midway losses and the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign, which began just 2 months later in August of 1942, consumed Japanese naval aviation's experienced manpower at a rate that the training pipeline could not keep pace with. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, almost exactly 2 years after Midway, Japanese naval aviators were being committed to combat with such abbreviated training that American pilots, in radio communications intercepted and listened to with a kind of appalled admiration, began calling it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The thread runs direct from the dungeon at Pearl Harbor to the Marianas, from Rockefort's intercepts to Nimitz's positioning of the carriers at Point Luck, from the water ruse to the confirmation that AF was Midway, from the intelligence victory that preceded the battle to the military victory that decided it. There is one more element of this story that deserves attention before it closes. Not because it changes the outcome, but because it illuminates something about the nature of intelligence work and the particular kind of courage it requires. In the days and weeks before the battle, as Rockefort was pressing his analysis of the intercepts and fighting for Nimitz's confidence against the countervailing assessments from Washington, there was a significant possibility that he was wrong. The fragments he was reading were not complete messages. They were reconstructions from partial intercepts, inferences drawn from patterns, probability assessments built on accumulated knowledge of Japanese communication habits. The water ruse confirmed AF as Midway, but it did not confirm the timing, the composition of the Japanese force, or the specific route of approach with certainty. What Rockefort had was not certainty. He had a best estimate. He had, as he put in his own phrasing, an 80% confidence that AF was Midway and that the Japanese main strike force would approach from the northwest on or around the 4th of June. An 80% confidence means a 20% chance of being wrong. If Nimitz positioned his carriers at Point Luck and the Japanese struck somewhere else, he would have expended the majority of his Pacific Fleet carrier strength on a futile ambush while leaving the actual target undefended. The consequence of that failure would have been catastrophic. Potentially the loss of Hawaii, Certainly a strategic disaster that would have extended the war by years and cost hundreds of thousands of additional lives. Rockefort knew this. He argued for his estimate anyway, because he believed it was right, and because the alternative, hedging pulling back, deferring to Washington's more conservative assessment, seemed to him a greater risk than the possibility of being wrong. This is a form of courage that intelligence work demands and rarely receives credit for, not the physical courage of the dive bomber pilot, not the visceral heroism of the man who advances under fire, but the moral courage of the analyst who puts his professional reputation, and potentially the outcome of a campaign, behind a probabilistic judgment that cannot be proven in advance and will only be vindicated or destroyed by events. Rockefort was vindicated, and then, in the way that institutions have, he was punished for it. Joseph Rockefort died on the 20th of July, 1976, in Los Angeles. He was 75 years old. He had spent the years after the war in relative obscurity, occasionally consulted by historians, generally content to let the record speak for itself. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him, a bitter man. He was precise, occasionally acerbic, deeply private, and possessed of a dry humor that surfaced most often when he was discussing the gap between what had actually happened and what the official record said had happened. He once remarked, with characteristic understatement, that intelligence officers are generally more useful to their country than they are rewarded by it. He said it as though he were reporting a meteorological fact. The 4 Japanese carriers that his work helped to destroy, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, lie on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, 2 to 3 miles below the surface, in roughly the area where the battle was fought. Akagi was located by an expedition in 2019, the wreck resting upright on the seabed at approximately 18,000 feet. The flight deck, where so many aircraft had been spotted and fueled and armed again in those chaotic morning hours of the 4th of June, is still there. The fires burned out 77 years ago. The steel is cold now. The Pacific is very quiet at that depth. The men who died on those flight decks, the Japanese pilots and deck crews and engineers, most of them young, most of them with families who would spend the rest of their lives not quite knowing what happened, were not cynics or monsters. They were, in the most ordinary sense, soldiers doing their jobs, caught inside a machine whose senior commanders had made decisions they had no power to question or correct. The machine had told them they were unbeatable. The machine had told them the Americans would not be waiting. The machine had been wrong. And in a basement in Pearl Harbor, a man in carpet slippers had known it was wrong before the battle began. After Midway, Japan never again held a strategic initiative in the Pacific. The 6 months of seemingly unstoppable expansion, what Japanese commanders called the victory disease period, ended in a single day, not because their entire military was destroyed overnight, but because the 4 carriers that burned on June 4th were the spine of the offensive capability that had made their blitzkrieg-style advances possible. Japan rebuilt. New carriers, new pilots, new aircraft, but the combined losses of Midway and the grinding Guadalcanal campaign consumed experienced naval manpower faster than the training pipeline could replace it. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, 2 years later, Japanese pilots were being sent into combat so undertrained that American pilots began calling it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The thread runs directly from Rockefort's basement to that slaughter. Rockefort himself received none of the recognition he had earned while he was alive. The Red Man brothers maneuvered him out of station. HYPO months after the battle, Admiral Nimitz recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal. Washington rejected it. He was reassigned to a series of posts that amounted to a deliberate diminishment, the institutional punishment of a man who had been right at the expense of powerful people who had been wrong. He died on July 20th, 1976, in Los Angeles at 75. By all accounts, he was not a bitter man. He was precise, occasionally dry, and deeply private. He once remarked, with characteristic understatement, that intelligence officers are generally more useful to their country than they are rewarded by it. Delivered, those who knew him said, as though he were simply reporting the weather. His Distinguished Service Medal was awarded posthumously in 1985, 43 years after battle and 9 years after his death. What this story ultimately demands is recognition of a particular kind of courage that rarely gets credited. Not the physical courage of the dive bomber pilot pulling out a near-vertical attack through walls of anti-aircraft fire, but the moral courage of the analyst who stakes his professional reputation and potentially the outcome of an entire campaign on a probabilistic judgment that cannot be proven in advance. Rockefort knew he might be wrong. He pressed his case anyway, because he believed the evidence, and because hedging seemed to him the greater danger. He was vindicated, and then, as institutions tend to do, his institution punished him for it. The 4 Japanese carriers still lie on the floor of the Pacific, 2 to 3 miles down. The fires burned out long ago. The steel is cold, and in a basement in Pearl Harbor, a man in carpet slippers had known the outcome before the battle began. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.